right, greetings, family. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I'm here with you again. Excuse me, Street to the Statehouse. Just want to give some updates on the work that we're doing and other organizations are doing in Annapolis as relates to legislative advocacy, particularly issues that have a particular impact on Black people. So again, just want to say greetings and welcome for all those that are going to watch live and those who are going to watch later. The legislative advocacy work can be complicated. There are lots of issues happening at once. And so, again, the purpose of this podcast is to provide some of the comprehensive explanation that folks are interested in terms of really understanding what's happening in Annapolis. And what I want to do first, because what I want to do is I'm going to talk about some legislative efforts that others are engaged in, like other folks who are doing work in Annapolis are engaged in. And then I'm going to talk specifically about our legislative priorities. But before I do that, just want to kind of talk generally about our perspective, like LBS's perspective, because I think it'll play a role in kind of how you listen to and think about some of the issues that we're going to raise. When we think about the issue of Black liberation, it's a term that's thrown around a lot. And it's important that, just because an effort aims to help Black people generally, it's important to understand like the extent of the specific impact that particular policy efforts have. And when you look at the work generally that our community does, to really have a sense of how to understand the roles that different organizations have and different efforts play. And what I want to talk about as it relates to Black liberation is the role of legislative advocacy. Because when we think about traditionally how legislative advocacy has positioned itself in our community, it's primarily centered around the notion of harm reduction. So when we're talking about Black liberation, we're talking about the importance of Black people practicing sovereignty and freedom. And there are a variety of different aspects to that work, whether it's, building institutions, right? Financial institutions, community-based institutions, civic institutions. There's also, health and wellness, particular to the conditions that face Black people, and building the practice and tools and skills needed to address the trauma that we face, right? To use our ancestral, healing modalities and technologies in order to advance our well-being as a community. These are examples of other important roles that people who are engaged in Black liberation participate in. Legislation, again, traditionally has been one of those aspects of work that has been reduced merely to harm reduction, which is important. This system and the systems that govern the society do harm to Black people, and legislative advocacy can do the work of reducing the harm that is that is done to our community. But it's also important that we're clear that when we talk about Black liberation, we're talking about the combination of stopping the harm that's done to our community, but also pushing back and having an offensive strategy against attacking the institutions that undermine humanity of people of African descent. And whether that's just the actual passing the legislation, but also the advocacy and conversation that happens around it. And so that's that frame is the frame that I want to use to talk about actually some of the other legislative efforts that other organizations and individuals are engaged in Annapolis. Because much of the work that I'll reference, much of it has to do with the criminal justice system. And when we think about the impact of the criminal justice system, Maryland is a state that has a unique problem. Maryland, 70% of the prison population are Black people, even though we constitute only 30% of the state. In fact, Maryland has the highest percentage of Black people in its prison system of any state in the United States. So as a state that claims to be so progressive, one of the questions that we should ask ourselves if we're interested in Black liberation, what are the forces that are allowing the policies that govern this state? How is it that those policies are resulting in such a devastating data point that characterizes Maryland, again, as having the highest population of Black people in its prison system in the United States, the highest percentage of Black folks? And so a lot of the policies that I'm going to talk about in many ways relate to this. Before I get to those policies specifically, one last thing I want to add as some framing, and it's something I've talked about a lot, but I really want to hammer home. When we think about the notion of racism and white supremacy, and we think about the way that it's impacted the collective American consciousness, people of African descent, brown people and other people of color more broadly, are understood primarily in terms of pathology, notions of inherent criminality, notions of black inferiority. Those things govern the American collective consciousness. And those things then also govern the nature of the policies that are made and how they're implemented. There is a tremendous lack of regard for the humanity of people of African descent that governs so much of the policies that have driven us in the direction that we're in. So we talk about the issue of mass incarceration. What has allowed the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration to get to the proportions that it had gotten to is that fundamental disregard for the dehumanizing impact that being absorbed into the criminal justice system has on people that are subject to it. And so when we think about black people being those who are the most likely to be sucked into those systems, and you think about the way that policies are made, policies are often made from the vantage point that there needs to be some whether it's in some cases a punishment-centric approach, right? These are bad people. They need to be punished so that they can be more morally upright and just. And unfortunately, those are the narratives that govern much of the policies that exist in Maryland that lead to a highly racialized, white supremacist institutional arrangement that I described earlier. It is that very notion politically that is salient, that there are elections, that there are state's attorneys, and there are county executives and local council people, state representatives, that their electability is the extent to which they are able to resonate with these fundamentally white supremacist, anti-black notions that again revolve around these notions of criminality. So I'm going to start with one of the policies I'm going to start off with, a policy that's been a fight for many years. Our current Senator, Jill Carter, who previously was in the House of Delegates, it's something that she's been working on her entire career, and there have been many advocates. I've been doing advocacy for a while, and it's an effort that I've been familiar with at this point for at least like more than 10 years, maybe up to 15 years that I know of the effort to stop the automatic charging of youth as adults. There are a variety of organizations that have, the Office of the Public Defender, and a variety of other organizations that have been involved in this fight to stop the automatic charging of youth as adults. And just a brief description of what we're talking about here is that even for the most serious crimes, there are a list of, I think, about 33 crimes that if one is charged with, a younger person is charged with, they're automatically sent to the adult system. It's important to note that the juvenile system, the system for young people, provides services and supports that don't exist in the adult system. Also in the adult system, you're exposing young people to just much harsher circumstances. So the idea is that a young person who is charged with any crime should start in the juvenile system. And if a judge finds that it's more appropriate for that young person to go to the adult system, then they are waived up. But that young people at the very least should start in the juvenile system. These are alleged crimes, right? So if a young person is alleged of engaged in even the most horrible crime, because then they're supposed to be innocent till proven guilty, they should start in the juvenile system. The fact that this piece of legislation has been so difficult to pass is a sad commentary on the state of Maryland politics and what it values. And additionally, I would argue that it's one of those policies that explains why Maryland has the highest population of black people imprisoned of any state in the United States, because of the way in which notions of black people, particularly black youth, are criminalized. A study that I've quoted extensively when I've testified in Annapolis and probably on this podcast previously, the essence of innocence. Professor Philip Goff and a variety of other researchers, they did a study, and that study looked at the way in which black youth and white youth are perceived differently and the nature of those perceptions. And some of the key findings from this study showed that black youth were seen as inherently less innocent, inherently more culpable for their behavior than white youth. The study found that black youth are often assessed at about 6 years older than they actually are, 6 years older than their white counterparts. And so there's a level of harsher treatment that young people receive that their white counterparts do not receive. So the fact that getting rid of a policy that automatically charges youth as adults, and if you think about the way that this issue has been politicized, right, that anytime there is an incident where young people are involved, where there's violent activity, that it is politicized in a way that causes the kind of hysteria that results in resistance against these kind of policies, right? And there are people that, again, that politically benefit from peddling those notions and stereotypes and stigmas. So, again, it's a sad commentary. Best of luck and wishes and support to those that are supporting that effort. And the next time we do the podcast, we'll make sure to give an update as to how that's going. Again, it's a bill that constantly gets pushed back and resistance every year. It's something that is really past due. Another set of policies is, one of the things that we have fought against, in many sessions, and if you go back in the archives of the work that LBS has done, whenever there's a spike in homicide, there are often proposals for increased criminal penalties, sentence enhancements, mandatory minimums. And so, and there have been a couple of bills that have, that attempt to enhance sentences. I think the work that, our organization and many others have done to push back against the fact that sentence enhancements actually are not effective crime fighting deterrents has helped make it so that there aren't dramatic sentence enhancements that are viable, I think, in the legislature. But there are, a few pieces of legislation that do attempt to increase criminal penalties. And it's going to be very important that we push that none really sneak through, right? I think Democrats generally, when it comes to, wanting to be progressive, or at least not, be on the wrong side of criminal justice reform, that a lot of them are hesitant to put forward kind of dramatic sentence enhancements. But there are, again, because of the way that white supremacy operates and the notion of punishment-centric approaches to dealing with problems of violence is something that has been so internalized, injected into our consciousness. It has created a dynamic where there are political benefits to folks that are engaged in that kind of in those kind of politics, regardless of how ineffective those approaches are. And so, just want to alert people to a couple of bills, or one particular bill that does that. A gentleman that I've actually gone back and forth with, if you watch one of our previous videos of myself testifying, Senator Folden, who is a Republican out of Frederick County, who's on the Judicial Proceedings Committee. He has a bill, Senate Bill 745, that actually does increase sentences, really as an attempt to deal with gun violence in Baltimore City. I'll likely be testifying tomorrow against that piece of legislation, again, under the same pretext that enhanced sentences doesn't address violent crime. One of the things that, and Senator Folden also is a member of law enforcement, he's a law enforcement officer. One of the things that often gets, even though there has been some meaningful police accountability work that's been done legislatively, law enforcement still is often let off the hook when it comes to the question of public safety and the extent to which law enforcement is in disarray and continues to operate under a culture of corruption, a culture that has disregard for black people, and therefore, wanting to address the pain that black people face is a lower priority. So that's something that permeates through law enforcement is a much bigger contributor to why violence is so rampant in our community than the amount of sentences that exist for certain kinds of crime. And we see this attempt at protecting law enforcement with another piece of legislation that Senator Fulton has sponsored, Senate Bill 752, which is a bill that would allow a police officer, after it's called a charging committee that reviews an investigation of law enforcement after a complaint of misconduct has been made. That was what Senate Bill 752 does is it allows an officer before the trial board part of the process that if they feel like the process was unfair in any way, it allows them to take it to a court. Part of the problem with that is that allowing an officer to make this motion of show cause under the idea that they feel that the process was unfair, this process would elongate the disciplinary process, and in some ways would run out the clock because you only have a year of investigation that is available when it comes to allegations of misconduct. And so it's an attempt to run out the clock on an investigation and essentially just elongate the disciplinary process. So these are ways in which law enforcement is able to protect itself, even though its primary responsibility of public safety, they've been ineffective at delivering on. And it makes sense to us that they would be ineffective at delivering on it because public safety is something that really law enforcement should not be the center of. Law enforcement, as the society is currently constituted, should be the last resort. And we want to build to a place where our community has the capacity to deal with violence. But in the meantime, the role that law enforcement does play, they are ineffective at that job. And unfortunately, there's more willingness to create policies that have the ability to subject more people who shouldn't be to the criminal justice system than there is to truly hold law enforcement accountable to the extent that they are responsible for the inability for public safety to be delivered for our communities. Another piece of legislation that I want to alert folks to, and this is something that we actually had a meeting, I mentioned this a couple of podcasts ago, where we actually had a meeting with the Attorney General. And one of the bills that the Attorney General is putting in is a bill that would allow the Attorney General to do pattern and practice investigations of local law enforcement, right, and also corrections, Department of Corrections. That is something that we actually think is a good idea. When you think about what happened in Baltimore City, the uprising created an opening for the Department of Justice to come into Baltimore and to do an investigation. And that 2016 DOJ report is a report that I reference pretty regularly, right? Because when you think about the fact that before that, people who would talk about instances of police misconduct and brutality weren't believed, right? Because a lot of the nature of the systemic corruption of law enforcement wasn't documented and made public to the extent that report did. And so that report provided several extensively documented examples of ways in which law enforcement engaged in misconduct. And it is their engagement in this misconduct, having that evidence, that has helped to push legislation beyond some of the more conservative leaning limitations that there were in terms of what we can do on law enforcement reform. And so that's a bill that we're watching and supportive of, but I wanted to raise it, as an example of what I would argue is the work of organizations like ours and others that are pushing the legislature in a way where, something like that kind of legislation would be viable. What I've said on Anton's Law, which was passed back in 2021, that changed the Maryland Public Information Act, that allow investigatory records of law enforcement to be made disclosable to the public. And we argue that law enforcement, that's one of the things that they were most fearful of. Because if they were to be exposed, if these records were to go out, I think we find out a whole lot more about some of the problematic practices of law enforcement agencies around the state. And similarly, I think this piece of legislation, if enacted, would put counties all over the state in a spot where there would be a level of transparency that would lead to policies that would ultimately lead to what we've always said is the pinnacle, community oversight. So just wanted to call attention, to that piece of legislation. Again, that was brought forward by the Attorney General, and we're appreciative of that bill even being put forward. All right. So now I want to talk about LBS's priorities, and I think it's important. I wanted to give a lot of that context because I think it really helps to frame where we are in terms of LBS's priorities. So I want to start with one of the big ones, which is prohibiting law enforcement from the sole use of odor as the basis for probable cause for search and seizure. As people should know by now, the voters in Maryland overwhelmingly voted for cannabis, recreational cannabis, to be legalized. And so now what the legislature is doing is developing the regulations for the industry, right? So that's happening as we speak, and I'll talk about that later on in the program. But also there needs to be some redress, right? So there has been some done by the legislature around expungement for possession. There's still more that needs to be done there. But additionally, we have to look at the way that law enforcement interacts with black people. One of the things that I was actually told by a gentleman who's former law enforcement is that anytime police can get around Fourth Amendment protections, right? Anytime that they can just find a reason to search and seize whenever they think something's going on but they don't have the evidence to prove it, they seek it out. And the odor of cannabis is one of those things that law enforcement uses as a rationale to violate people's rights. And black people constitute in Maryland the majority of those that are pulled over, right? And so when we think about the interaction between black people and law enforcement, we know that we want to decrease the amount of interactions that black people have with law enforcement because black people have been the most susceptible to police brutality and misconduct by law enforcement. So given the fact that cannabis is legal, given the fact that now people will be able to legally consume it, our concern is that if we don't prohibit the sole use of odor, then it creates a context where law enforcement will be able to abuse that even more. And so law enforcement has testified against this effort in both chambers. And we think and we'll actually likely post some clips from what the opposition said in the House because there are some quite entertaining clips there of just how law enforcement is just so dependent on cannabis-related arrests as the basis for dealing with public safety, and they produce no evidence, no substantive evidence as to how cannabis prohibition policy is an effective deterrent as it relates to public safety. We've challenged law enforcement to produce it, and they've not produced it at any of the hearings or forums, platforms that I've observed law enforcement be on. And so the 20th is crossover, and we need odor not only to get out of committee, but we need it to come out in a way that's actually meaningful. There have been attempts to water down the legislation, to put amendments in that will potentially water down the legislation. And so part of the work that myself and others are going to be doing in the next few days is to ensure that a version of the bill passes that actually meaningfully accomplishes the goal that I've talked about in terms of not allowing law enforcement to abuse people's rights by using the odor of cannabis as the basis for how they do that. And then the prohibiting or removing rather criminal penalties for possession above the 2.5 limit and possession with intent to distribute, and replacing those with civil citations. That's important, similar to the odor. If cannabis is legalized, we don't want people are going to be moving, likely people are going to be moving with amounts that they haven't measured. And so we don't want to subject people to be moving with whatever amounts of cannabis and be subject to criminal penalties, right? If, again, it is legalized. And we don't want that to become a rationale as to sucking people into the criminal justice system. Um, so these are two pieces of legislation that will be, like, over the next, week or so, we're going to be pushing extremely hard to get out of the committees, off the floor in both chambers, in a posture where these pieces of legislation are able to pass. And I'm gonna say this, and I said this, a few days ago on the radio, is that these two pieces of legislation should be no brainers. I'm actually kind of disappointed that we've had to work this hard on both these pieces of legislation. Because again, with the legalization of cannabis, it should be a no brainer. And going back to what I said at the top, that 70% of Maryland's prison population is black. And I would argue the fact that these two pieces of legislation have been so hard to move is evidence, right, to the fact that it is the notions of racism and white supremacy, notions of black pathology, that still govern the policies in the state of Maryland. And it's going to take a lot of work to push us in a direction where we can say that we're moving away from that. But if these two pieces of legislation, odor, like not using odor as the primary basis for a probable cause for search and seizure for a substance that's legal, and removing the criminal penalties, replacing it with civil citations, that if we can't do that, then that is a sad commentary on Maryland. And when particularly when we talk about working class people, black people that live in poverty, black people that live in communities plagued with poverty, it just can't be overstated the extent to which we should consider it a failure on the part of our legislature to live up to any moniker that could be considered racial justice. And so you'll see, if you haven't already, you'll see the action alerts that we've put out. Please contact your legislator because this is the week where we're going to need to really be pounding the pavement and making sure that we can push these things through. So those are the two kind of major legislative pushes that we're making. We're asking you all, supporters of LBS, to help us and push some of that through. Lastly, in terms of the cannabis piece in Annapolis, one of the other things that you've seen is us testify about the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. So in 2022, Senator Carter sponsored a bill that was the Cannabis Legalization and Reparations for the War on Drugs Act. And in that bill, there was the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. So that served as the reparations portion of that piece of legislation. And we were able, through the support and help and advocacy of Senator Antonio Hayes, who sits on the Finance Committee, which is where that bill moved, that he was able to effectively put that in the bill that ultimately passed last year, that established the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund, where at least 30% of the revenues that come from recreational cannabis will go into a fund to come back to the communities impacted by the war on drugs. And the thing I'm going to end on is about the implementation part that we're doing here in Baltimore City. But the work that we're having to do as it relates to making sure that sufficient resources come back to the community is that in an attempt to deal with the black market, to ensure that the black market doesn't overshadow the new recreational market that'll open up soon. There's been on the House actually passed their version of the regulations of cannabis, the recreational market, that the tax rate starting at 6%, just a straight sales tax of 6%, that then would graduate to 10% by 2028. And while we understand the importance, and there's some testimony that you'll see on our platforms where our Director of Research, Lawrence Grand Prix, testified to the committee about this concern, that if the tax rate is too low, we're talking about millions of dollars that we'd be missing. I think Lawrence said in his testimony on Thursday that there'd be about $75 million of revenue that we'd be losing over the next several years if we kept the tax rate that low. And it's easily the lowest tax rate in the country. 15% would make it the lowest tax rate in the country. We've advocated to start it at 10 and go to 14. So that's an amendment that we're putting on the bill to ensure that enough resources come back to the communities impacted by the war on drugs. There's been a lot of emphasis in terms of the business side of this on making sure that black people have access to the industry. And I would say that the legislature has done a reasonably decent job of trying to develop a piece of legislation and a regulatory structure that does that. I think part of the challenge that we want to make sure is clear is while the legislature is considering that, it's important that we're clear that the biggest opportunity for working class black people to get access to dollars will be through the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund, through this reparations fund, and that the communities impacted by the war on drugs should receive material compensation for the damage that's been done. And that should not be contingent on being in the recreational cannabis industry. That those communities should get the resources needed to repair the harm that's done, independent of participating in the industry. That's why the fund was set up. And that's why it's important that there's enough revenue in this fund that will be meaningful enough that it can actually do something in the communities impacted. And so, for more on that, you'll find videos of our testimony that talk about, and some action alerts that talk about what it is that we want for the bill that regulates the industry around the Community Reinvestment Fund. Last thing I want to talk about, implementation for the reparations fund, the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. So what the language does, what it did last year, and as we hope to amend it to revert it back to the language from last year, each jurisdiction gets a percentage of the fund. That percentage is determined by that jurisdiction's contribution to statewide cannabis-related arrests from a 20-year period from 2002 to 2022, right? And we picked a 20-year period. One, because we wanted to make sure that there was, data available. You start going back a little further, and data may be less available. But we think that time period is an accurate reflection of the nature of cannabis prohibition policy and how it's impacted each of the different jurisdictions. So each jurisdiction would get it based on that percentage. And what that does, it makes sure that those resources are distributed equitably, so that those jurisdictions that were most impacted get a larger percent of it. So we're sure Baltimore City, Prince George's County, two of the blackest jurisdictions in the state, should receive a majority of the resources because they were impacted disproportionately. Each jurisdiction will have to pass a law that determines how those resources are spent, right? So we didn't want it to just go to the executive. We wanted to ensure that at least the community had the ability to impact how those resources were distributed. And so we advocated and successfully were able to have the bill say that each jurisdiction has to pass a law that determines how that jurisdiction spends its portion. We're currently working with Nick Mosby's office, the council president in Baltimore City, and Councilman Chris Burnett, who are the co-sponsors of Baltimore's bill that would essentially be implementation for the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund for Baltimore City. And what this bill would do is that it would establish a reparations commission. That reparations commission will be appointed by the mayor, but will be based on recommendations that are given from the council. So the council will make recommendations, and the mayor will appoint from the recommendations given to them by the council. So again, this helps to balance out the power, to make it so that it's not concentrated in the executive and the mayor in this instance, and that the council plays a role, that the community has an opportunity to voice its concerns, voice its ideas to the council as to how the reparations commission will be constituted. And our hope is that other jurisdictions will follow suit using the reparations framework, connecting the fact that these revenues, the spirit of which it was passed was repairing the harm done, right? So we talk about reparations for the war on drugs as a unique first step and thinking about how, as a matter of policy, how we pursue reparations as a matter of policy. And the last thing I'll say, particularly about reparations, there's an August 2022 op-ed I wrote in the Afro-American newspaper where I cite Raymond Wimbush, who actually lives in Baltimore, director of the Institute of Urban Research, one of the most renowned reparations scholars in the country. And he wrote a book in 2003, Should America Pay, which is a great compilation of essays about reparations. And one of the things that Dr. Wimbush says is that reparations comes from a black nationalist policy demand, and and to extrapolate on that, to say that what that means is that reparations is about investing in the ability for black people to practice sovereignty and freedom. So reparations isn't just about giving out money or just giving out money to invest in programs, but it's about thinking about what ecosystems do we need to be able to practice a level of relative autonomy where we can exist in the world, engage civil society from a position of strength, power, and self-determination. And so that it's important that those that serve on this commission, if you read the actual legislation, the qualifications include people for whom have a body of work related to reparations or the war on drugs, people who have produced educational material, because it's going to be very important that those who are on the reparations commission have a perspective that is about empowering the community as opposed to extending the existing system. And so we hope to have a commission that'll reflect that. All right, so look, that's really the legislative update. As I mentioned before, crossover is on Monday the 20th, so there're going to be a lot of, you'll see the action alerts. I want to reiterate that those action alerts are tremendously helpful. That when you send them, it gives us leverage to be able to push legislators in the direction we need. And Adam has done a great job of designing the website in a way where when you go to the action alert, it makes it extremely easy for you to be able to send something to your legislator. And so please don't hesitate to go to our action alerts, tell your legislator, that you support our work, you support the bills that we're trying to get passed and the posture we want them passed. And if you feel so inclined, even call your legislator, call the folks on the committee, call the chairman, inundate them with calls, because again, they respond to constituents. These are folks with political careers, and when they see that there are a whole bunch of eyeballs and attention on it, it's something that makes them move in that direction. And so, we encourage people to call and respond to the action alerts. Additionally, we have a lobby day where we're going to discuss, and you'll see legislators, and we'll be in Annapolis discussing the legislation that we will be pushing for in Annapolis. And so we really urge people to join us March 16th. There'll be a bus that leaves from Langston Hughes Business Resource Center around 7:15ish. And so you'll see all the information about that on all the relevant social media and on our website. So if you're interested, please participate. Come down and spend half a day with us as it relates to our legislative work. And then what I'll also say, and I'll end on this, is that what makes what we're able to do possible is the contribution of individual people that support the work that we do. And so, if you see up on the top left hand of your screen, if you want to become a sustainer and contribute to us every month, we're at about like 500, more than 500 people that give us money monthly. And that helps us to sustain the work that we do, so we're able to exercise the level of independence that we're able to exercise. There aren't many organizations that can call out, specific elected officials, right? And if you see our action alerts, we're very direct about, elected officials and who needs to be reached out to. And you may see an update from us where if we may say, Chairman Luke Clippinger is a problem, right? We may need to alert folks of that so that people can put extra pressure on them. We may say, Chairman Will Smith is a problem, right? And we need to push them on that. and we're in a position to be able to make those kinds of calls because of the fact we're able to say those things freely and still able to be able to operate in Annapolis in terms of our legislative advocacy because of the support of the community. And so if you support the work that we do and our ability to provide this information, please sign up to become a sustainer, to contribute to us monthly, to unapologetic, black approaches to advocacy that center the importance on, legislative advocacy. And so yeah, I want to again thank everybody for tuning in. Thank you for signing up. Thank you all that are going to take the time to do the action alerts. This week is a crucial week. Look out for some, there may be some updates that we send out about people that are in our way. So if you see it come across your screen or come across your desk, please just help us out because it's going to contribute to our ability to move legislation forward. All right, so with that, I want to thank you all, Peace family, for joining us once again. Again, look out for updates from us. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about particular efforts that we're working on. And continue to be supportive. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Have a good night.